something shifted in August 2025. The United States national debt reached $37 trillion. 2 months later, it hit $38 trillion, $1 trillion in 60 days. This isn't the pace of a country managing its finances. This is acceleration toward a breaking point, and yet no emergency sessions, no austerity announcements, no crisis meetings. Because the people in charge already know what comes next. They're preparing to eliminate this debt using a mechanism most people have never heard of. One that's been used throughout history, always with the same result. The debt gets lighter, and the currency in your pocket quietly loses value. This is forgotten economy, where hidden financial forces meet historical patterns. Let me show you just how fast this is moving. The Congressional Budget Office calculates that the federal government has been accumulating debt at roughly $70,000 per second over the past year. Every single second. While you slept last night, the debt grew by over $6 million. By the time you finish watching this video, hundreds of thousands more. This isn't gradual decline. This is exponential acceleration. The debt crossed $37 trillion in August. Just 2 months later, $38 trillion. That's $1 trillion in 60 days. Outside of the COVID pandemic, this represents the fastest accumulation of debt in American history. The Congressional Budget Office projects it will surpass $40 trillion by 2027, 2 years away. We're adding $10 trillion every 5 years, and the velocity is increasing. Here's what makes this particularly unusual. This is happening while the economy is supposedly strong. Unemployment is low. GDP is growing. Corporate profits are solid if debt is accumulating this fast during good times. What happens when the next recession arrives? When unemployment spikes and tax revenues collapse while spending on social programs explodes? The mathematics don't just stop working, they become impossible. But the raw debt number only tells part of the story. The real crisis is hiding in plain sight, in the federal budget itself. Interest payments on the national debt have become the fastest growing component of government spending. In fiscal year 2025, the United States paid over $1 trillion. Just in interest, not principal, just interest. To put that in context, that's more than the entire defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any single government program except Social Security. Think about what this means. Nearly 1 in every $5 that taxpayers send to Washington buys nothing. No roads, no schools, no defense, no health care, just interest payments to bondholders. It's like making minimum payments on a credit card while the balance keeps growing faster than you can pay it down. The average interest rate on the national debt is currently 3.38%. That's up from 1.58% just 5 years ago. With $38 trillion in debt, every percentage point increase in interest rates adds $380 billion in annual interest payments. Here's the trap the government has created for itself. They need to keep borrowing to pay the interest on existing debt. But the more they borrow, the higher interest rates go. Because bond buyers demand higher returns for increased risk. Higher interest rates make the debt more expensive to service, which requires more borrowing, which pushes rates even higher. This is called a debt spiral, and once it starts, it's almost impossible to stop through normal fiscal policy. The Congressional Budget Office projects that interest costs will rise from $4 trillion over the past decade to $14 trillion over the next 10 years. That's not gradual increase, that's explosion. Within a decade, the government will be spending more on interest than on defense, Medicare, and education combined. The budget becomes nothing but interest payments and Social Security. Everything else gets squeezed out. But here's what the government knows that most people don't understand. They have another option. A way to eliminate debt without actually paying it back. It's called debt monetization. And it's been used by governments throughout history when conventional fiscal policy fails. The process is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its consequences. Here's how debt monetization works. Instead of borrowing money from private investors by selling bonds, the government borrows directly from the central bank. The Federal Reserve creates new money out of nothing and uses that newly created money to buy government bonds. The government gets the cash it needs to operate. The Federal Reserve gets bonds that pay interest, and the money supply increases by exactly the amount of new debt created. This is often called printing money, though no actual printing is involved in the digital age. The Federal Reserve simply creates electronic reserves and credits them to the Treasury's account. From the government's perspective, it's nearly free money. They get to spend without having to raise taxes or cut programs. The debt technically still exists on the balance sheet, but it's owed to the Federal Reserve, which is essentially owned by the government itself. The profits from Federal Reserve holdings get sent back to the Treasury anyway. So the government is essentially paying interest to itself. It's like taking money out of your left pocket, putting it in your right pocket, and claiming you've paid off your credit card. The accounting shows the debt is being serviced, but no real wealth has changed hands. This isn't theory, this is precedent. This mechanism has already been tested on a massive scale. During the 2008 financial crisis, and again during the COVID pandemic, the Federal Reserve purchased trillions of dollars in government bonds through programs called quantitative easing. They claimed these purchases were temporary, designed to stabilize financial markets. But the effect was identical to debt monetization. The government borrowed money that was created out of nothing by the central bank. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion at its peak in 2021. That's $8 trillion in newly created money used to purchase government and corporate bonds. Without these purchases, the government would have had to find private buyers for all that debt. Interest rates would have skyrocketed. Borrowing costs would have become unsustainable. But with the Federal Reserve creating money to buy bonds, interest rates stayed low, and the government could continue borrowing. The public was told this was monetary policy, not fiscal policy. The Fed was managing the money supply, not funding government spending. But the distinction is largely semantic. When the central bank creates money to buy government debt, the effect is the same regardless of what you call it. The government gets funded, the money supply expands, and the purchasing power of every existing dollar slowly erodes. After 2021, the Federal Reserve announced it would begin reducing its balance sheet, allowing bonds to mature without replacement, slowly unwinding the extraordinary measures taken during the crises. And for a time, that happened. The balance sheet declined. But pay attention to what's happening now in late 2025. The balance sheet has stabilized. The reduction has slowed. And quietly, almost imperceptibly, the Federal Reserve has begun purchasing Treasury securities again, not in dramatic announcements, not in crisis press conferences, just steady monthly purchases of $40 billion in Treasury bonds. The public explanation is that these purchases are necessary to maintain adequate bank reserves, to ensure smooth functioning of financial markets. But examine what's actually occurring. The government is running trillion-dollar deficits. They need to borrow that money by selling bonds. And increasingly, the Federal Reserve is the buyer. This is the beginning of what comes next. Those monthly purchases will expand. 40 billion becomes 80 billion. Then 120 billion. Before long, the Federal Reserve is purchasing most new government debt issuance. The mechanism is already in motion. The only question is scale. This changes how the entire system works. And most people won't recognize it until years later. But the government needs more than just debt monetization to make $38 trillion manageable. They need a mechanism that makes it look like sound fiscal policy, something that gives them political cover while they expand the money supply. That mechanism is strategic asset revaluation. And it's been done before. The United States currently holds approximately 210,000 Bitcoin, seized from criminal enterprises over the years. At current prices, around $100,000 per coin, that's $21 billion in digital assets. Not nearly enough to offset a $38 trillion debt problem. But the government isn't planning to value Bitcoin at current market prices. They're positioning to revalue it at multiples of current prices through official reserve policy. Here's how the revaluation mechanism works. The government announces that Bitcoin will be held as a strategic reserve asset, similar to gold in Fort Knox. They declare that for balance sheet purposes, Bitcoin will be valued not at market prices, but at strategic reserve prices. If they announce Bitcoin is worth $500,000 per coin for government accounting purposes, their 210,000 Bitcoin suddenly becomes worth $105 billion on paper. They've created $84 billion in balance sheet value simply by changing the accounting price. This isn't speculation. It's exactly what the government did with gold in 1934. President Roosevelt revalued gold from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce overnight. The government's gold reserves increased in value by 69% without acquiring a single additional ounce. That revaluation created billions in balance sheet value that was used to offset government debt during the Great Depression. The same mechanism is being prepared for gold today. The United States officially holds 8,133 tons of gold, valued on government books at $42 per ounce. That's the statutory price set in 1973, not current market prices of around $2,800 per ounce. This creates enormous room for revaluation. If the government announces gold will be valued at $10,000 per ounce for reserve purposes, their gold holdings jump from $11 billion on the books to over $260 billion overnight. Combined with Bitcoin revaluation, the government could create hundreds of billions of dollars in balance sheet assets through nothing more than accounting changes. This gives them the appearance of fiscal strength while they monetize debt through Federal Reserve purchases. The books show valuable assets offsetting debt obligations. The reality is that they've simply changed the numbers while inflating away the debt's real value. The international implications of this strategy extend far beyond domestic policy. Foreign governments hold approximately $7 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. When the United States monetizes debt and revalues strategic assets, those foreign holdings lose purchasing power in real terms. Countries that trusted U.S. bonds as safe stores of value discover they've been paid back in devalued currency. This is why we're seeing accelerated movement away from dollar reserves among major economies. China reduced its treasury holdings by over $100 billion in 2024. Russia eliminated most of its dollar reserves after 2022. Saudi Arabia is accepting Chinese yuan for oil payments instead of requiring dollars. These aren't random policy decisions. These countries see what's coming, and they're positioning their economies accordingly. The BRICS nations have launched alternative payment systems specifically designed to bypass the dollar-dominated financial system. China and India are conducting trade in local currencies. Brazil is using its riel for regional transactions. Russia conducts 90% of its BRICS trade in local currencies rather than dollars. This de-dollarization movement isn't driven by political hostility alone. It's driven by economic self-preservation. As the United States prepares to inflate away its debt obligations, central banks worldwide are purchasing gold at record levels. The World Gold Council reported that central bank gold purchases reached the highest levels in decades during 2024 and 2025. China's central bank bought gold for 11 consecutive months through September 2025, bringing total reserves to over $280 billion in gold value. These purchases aren't random diversification. They're preparation for a monetary system where the dollar's purchasing power has been deliberately reduced. There's another shift happening that accelerates this timeline. The electric vehicle revolution is quietly dismantling the petrodollar system that has supported dollar demand for 50 years. 1 in 4 cars sold globally in 2025 is electric. Oil demand is projected to stagnate after 2026 and potentially decline by 2030 as electric vehicle adoption accelerates. Reduced oil trade means fewer transactions requiring dollar settlement. This weakens the mechanism that has supported international dollar demand for half a century. When countries no longer need dollars to purchase energy, when alternative payment systems allow trade without dollar intermediation, when central banks hold gold instead of treasury bonds, the demand for dollars collapses. All those dollars held overseas come flooding back to the United States. The money supply expands not just through domestic money creation, but through the return of dollars that were previously held abroad. This amplifies the inflationary impact of debt monetization, potentially doubling or tripling the effective money supply increase. The government knows this timeline is compressed. They have perhaps 5 to 10 years before de-dollarization reaches critical mass and international dollar demand collapses completely. That's why the debt monetization and asset revaluation strategies are being implemented now, while the dollar still maintains reserve currency status. Once that status is lost, the ability to export inflation through monetary expansion disappears. The United States would face the same constraints as any other country with unsustainable debt levels. The timeline for this isn't theoretical. It's operational. Every piece is moving into position. The mechanisms aren't hidden in classified documents. They're visible in Federal Reserve policy statements, Treasury announcements, and Congressional Budget Office projections. The government is broadcasting their intentions to anyone who understands the language of monetary policy. Within 18 months, you will likely see the Federal Reserve's monthly Treasury purchases expand from $40 billion to $100 billion or more. They'll justify this expansion as necessary to maintain market stability and ensure adequate bank reserves. The media will report it as responsible monetary management. But what's really happening is the systematic monetization of government debt on a scale that makes previous quantitative easing programs look like practice runs. By 2027, when debt hits $40 trillion, the government will face a choice that isn't really a choice at all. They can either default on their obligations, triggering a global financial catastrophe that would destroy American political and economic power permanently, or they can implement the full debt monetization strategy, while international dollar demand still provides cover for massive monetary expansion. The choice has already been made. This isn't normal, and the timeline is compressed. $38 trillion in debt. For most people, that number is so large it becomes abstract, something distant, something that doesn't touch daily life. But that debt is about to become very real, just not in the way you'd expect. Not through default, not through crisis, but through something quieter. The debt will be made lighter through the expansion of the money supply, through the revaluation of strategic assets, through mechanisms that most people won't recognize until years after they've been implemented. The government will point to falling debt to GDP ratios and claim victory. The accounting will show improvement, but the purchasing power of every dollar in existence will have quietly eroded. This is how governments have managed impossible debts throughout history. Not through austerity, not through growth, but through inflation. The debt doesn't disappear. It just becomes easier to carry because the currency it's denominated in is worth less, and everyone holding that currency pays the price. This is the forgotten mechanism, the one that's been used before, the one most people have stopped thinking about. But it's operating right now.